Hi there, my name is Troy Parfit. I'm the author of The Devil in His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler, and in today's talk we're going to examine the wisdom of Jordan Peterson's fans, or cult followers, or lobsters. During an interview with British GQ's Helen Lewis, Jordan Peterson irately denied that any of his followers had ties to the alt-right, yet previously he said that he knew he had followers who were alt-right, and saw from their comments online that they were also anti-Semitic. Despite Peterson's claims to be warning of a resurgence of neo-Nazism, he failed to denounce his followers for expressing Judeophobic views, or criticize himself for being unable to change their views. Peterson likes to say that he has received hundreds of letters from fans saying he saved them from the alt-right, which makes his claims to Helen Lewis even more circumspect. His argument seems to be his acolytes were alt-right, or headed for the alt-right, but that he somehow rescued them, therefore they were never alt-right, or moving toward the alt-right, and how dare anyone imply they are, or were. Furthermore, in an interview with the white supremacist and cult leader Stéphane Molyneux, Peterson identified as alt-right, saying, quote, "What should the so-called alt-right be concentrating on? And I would say, we don't want to have a war with the leftists," end quote. He added that we needed to provide a counter-narrative to the liberal narrative, because liberals are really Marxists who've got university curricula in a quote-unquote death grip. Peterson would have people believe that professors indoctrinate their students in, say, social cultural theory, so that when they graduate they can help turn the world into one big Soviet labor camp. To recap, Peterson is not alt-right, yet he is alt-right. His fans are not alt-right, but they are alt-right and anti-Semitic. Such remarks surpass chance contradiction. Instead, they are part of a pattern. For nearly every claim Jordan Peterson makes with insistence, you can find him emphatically making a counterclaim, and that's because he's a grandiose or malignant narcissist and a compulsive liar. Since narcissists can lie virtually all the time, a concept that can seem incomprehensible to non-narcissists, virtually anyone can be susceptible to a narcissist's lies. Even if you know someone is a chronic liar, lies can still slip through your defenses. In this case, the group that's most vulnerable to Peterson's fabrications is the Lobsters. Their guru's lies are the truth, and they unthinkingly reproduce this truth, that is, his lies. The Lobsters do this across a range of subjects, for example the rise of Adolf Hitler, the history of the Third Reich, and the Holocaust. And yes, they sometimes reveal they admire Nazism and dislike Jews. I know this because one day I put on my diving gear and plunged from the deck of the lobster boat to the cold and murky depths of the feeding grounds, which is to say I joined a Facebook group devoted to venerating the miraculous teachings of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson and asked his cult followers some questions. I also read comments under Peterson's videos on Hitler. In the Facebook group, I informed members of the Barmy Lobster Army that their leader had ladled out praise for Adolf Hitler and asked how they felt about that. I posted the following quote and question. Peterson: "One of the things I've always thought about Hitler is that, people, you have to admire Hitler. That's the thing, because he was an organizational genius. The thing that doesn't stop people from being Hitler." He realizes he's gone too far and begins to stammer. "The thing, people don't refuse the ambition to become Hitler because they don't have the genocidal motivation. They don't follow that pathway because they don't have the organizational genius. They've got the damned motivation." Question: why would Peterson say Hitler was an organizational genius? Do you agree with this view? I will now go through some of the responses. To understand how Lobster comments practically mirror Peterson's comments, Lobster statements are rendered in red and Peterson's in black. If you're just listening to this or can't see the quotes, I'll do Lobster remarks in a lower voice and Peterson's in a higher one. Lobster 1. Hitler was most likely a high-functioning psychopath as well. He did wonders for the industrial complexes. Peterson: "You can't say that he didn't do wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign, before his suppressed disgust took him over completely as well." Peterson: "Hitler was very sensitive to disgust. It's his genius that is studied, his method to his madness." From the surrounding text, we can speculate that the claim that Hitler was a high-functioning psychopath is a compliment. Lobster 2, quote, "Hitler was an organizational genius. Not to acknowledge that just means one is stuck in ideology thought patterns." End quote. Note how stuck in ideology thought patterns is like the claim that Peterson often makes to his critics, that they are radical leftists or closet communists who are ideologically possessed. JP has gone to great lengths to resuscitate the ghost of JM, Joseph McCarthy. Lobster 3, quote, Hitler was an organizational genius. Peterson, Hitler was an organizational genius, end quote. If Peterson had said Hitler was an oratorical prodigy, it's likely this crustacean would have said that Hitler was an oratorical prodigy. As Peterson has acknowledged, lobsters, quote, don't have much of a brain, end quote. Also, at Harvard, Peterson told his students, quote, people adopt absolute identification with a group in totalitarian or authoritarian states. And the motto of a totalitarian state is that everyone should act exactly the same way. So we're all absolutely predictable. That's what totalitarian means. Act the same way, think the same way, look the same way, believe the same things. And the advantage to that is that everyone becomes extraordinarily predictable, because everyone is a clone, fundamentally, end quote. Yes, everyone is a clone, or a lobster. And it isn't just in authoritarian states that people adopt absolute identification with a group. They do this in cults. Cult leaders tell their cult followers that the threat comes from without. This reduces the chances of the clones realizing that the genuine threat comes from within. Lobster 4, quote, there is no rule that says megalomaniacal psychopaths like Hitler are dumb. The man was a charismatic orator. Peterson, you can't say that he wasn't charismatic. He was a good orator and incredibly intelligent, end quote. Who's intelligent? An environmentalist? A novelist? A nurse with 20 years' experience? No, a mass murderer. Come, be enlightened by the wisdom of Peterson's lobsters. Lobster 5, quote, was he not an organizational genius? He was also a captivating orator. Peterson, he was a good orator. You appear to hold a childish view of him, end quote. Note the insult. Hitler was a genius, but I'm childish. Lobster 6, quote, Hitler was a well-refined, metaphysically cannibalistic, parasitically symbiotic entity that was tactful and purposeful in his self-destruction and self-creation re-imaging. The cautionary tale of the fire of creativity and high intelligence, end quote. As I document in The Devil in His Due, Peterson targets people with psychological issues. I had a glance at this lobster's profile, and it was heavy with artwork from the occult. I found several fans who are adherents of the Satanist Aleister Crowley and Jordan Peterson. Lobster 7, quote, you have to be pretty organized to pull off genocide and World War II, end quote. Peterson, Hitler didn't have quite as long a time as Mao to pull off his stunts. Peterson's grand theory about Hitler is that his war was an elaborate prank. All the pomp and ceremony, and talk about Lebensraum and establishing an orderly 1,000-year Reich was just a ruse to create a durable vortex of chaos that would yield widespread death and destruction. It was a prank born out of sheer malevolence. It was a stunt Hitler pulled off. Jordan Peterson is rather fond of stunts. His fight against compelled speech laws, which never existed and were never proposed, was a stunt that made him famous. And he's been playing a prank on his students and the public for nearly 30 years by plagiarizing Adolf Hitler. Lobster 8, quote, Hitler was a remarkably intelligent human being, end quote. Lobster 9, quote, apparently he, Hitler, was a great communicator. JP talks with a flow or highly intelligent, logical, scientific, and reflective wisdom, end quote. Note the parallelism. JP is a good speaker, and so is AH. Lobster 10, quote, well, Hitler was an organizational genius. Are you a moron, Troy? Such an instinctive and shameful liar that you would single out a stone-cold fact as somehow egregious because it is not PC? End quote. PC? Personal computer? Oh, the other PC. Piccadilly Circus. In the lobster feeding grounds, verbal abuse is standard fare. Arthropods who abuse critics or perceived threats to the dominance hierarchy are rewarded with likes. That way they can maintain their group identity or act like clones while pretending they are individuals. As Peterson has said, groups are necessary because, quote, a group answers the question, what is the good? Being a Nazi, end quote. Lobster 11. So I put it to you, have you the skill, fortitude, knowledge, and commitment to do anything on the scale that Hitler did? Yeah, Parfit, take that. Hitler killed millions. How many innocent men, women, and children have you murdered, huh? You'll never rise to the top of the dominance hierarchy being a snowflake. Gosh, am I a Stalinist or a snowflake? Come on, lobsters, make up your collective mind. Lobster 12. Quote, Jews used the fake Holocaust as a means of forming a pity party to devolve immunities and cultish ideologies, much like the blacks are doing now. End quote. Peterson, neo-Marxism is a cult ideology. Peterson has probably never denied the Holocaust, but he has encouraged his students to imagine themselves as the perpetrators, which is actually fairly common. History teachers in the UK, for instance, do this when teaching about the Third Reich, and members of the Frankfurt School said that students needed to imagine themselves as the perpetrators, bystanders, and victims. However, Peterson, who hates the Frankfurt School, has apparently amended this view by telling his learners, "Forget about the victims," meaning, forget about the Jews. He's forever teaching people to suffocate their empathy. Lobster 13, quote, "Cleansing of the temple," end quote. This is a comment under one of Peterson's Hitler videos. It's almost certainly a reference to a passage in Mein Kampf, where Hitler says, quote, "And the founder of Christianity made no secret about his estimation of the Jewish people. When he found it necessary, he drove those enemies of the human race out of the temple of God, because then, as always, they used religion as a means of advancing their commercial interests," end quote. Lobster 14, quote, "Just because Hitler was a loon doesn't mean he wasn't smart and isn't only known for what he did during the war," end quote. Hitler? Lobster 15, quote, "Hitler was clean, well organized, a great orator, passionate, and wholly committed to his cause," end quote. Lobster 16, quote, "In defense of Jordan Peterson, Hitler rose to power from nothing and conquered Europe," end quote. Lobster 17, quote, "The country, for one, Germany was mired in depression when Hitler was elected. The populace was starving." Peterson, "We should never forget that Hitler was elected. Less than a decade later, it was a global superpower. He was obsessed with cleanliness." Peterson, "Hitler was obsessed with order and cleanliness. Passing legislation in Germany to eliminate rat and flea populations and encouraging Germans to practice personal hygiene." Peterson, "He convinced the German factory owners to increase the levels of hygiene in the factories to get rid of the rats and the mice." And yes, the Holocaust, from an organizational perspective, was done effectively. Peterson, on the Holocaust, "The Germans were unorganized, are unorganized, were unorganized people," end quote. These are just a few examples of the Lobsters mimicking their leader on the subject of the Third Reich. I easily found more than 100, and if I made the effort, I would doubtlessly have found many more. From this sample, I cannot generalize. That is, I cannot say that many or most of Jordan Peterson's fans are closet neo-Nazis. Indeed, I can't really draw any firm conclusions. However, I can see a pattern. Some of Peterson's followers mimic his speech about Hitler, which is often factually incorrect. For instance, Hitler was not elected, nor did he encourage Germans to practice personal hygiene. However, he did encourage them to practice racial hygiene and said the Reich needed to be cleansed or cleaned up. There seems to be scant evidence to suggest Hitler was obsessed with bodily cleanliness, although there is substantial evidence to show that when Peterson refers to Hitler murdering innocent people, he uses the euphemism clean up, as in, quote, "Hitler cleaned up Germany's asylums," end quote. I found several accounts where people who met or knew Hitler described him as slovenly and unkempt. For instance, in John Toland's Adolf Hitler, the definitive biography, one of Hitler's roommates says Hitler used to press his pants by putting them under his mattress at night. There's another anecdote from someone who recalled the instant he first saw Hitler, the future Führer was wiping his nose on his sleeve. But let's say Hitler was exceedingly hygienic. Lots of people are, so why does Peterson only make a note of this regarding Hitler? And if, for argument's sake, we allow that Hitler really was a good orator, there have been many good orators, so why single out Hitler? If Peterson wants to praise a wartime orator, why not Winston Churchill? I imagine that Churchill was also fond of soap and water, and, unlike Hitler, he really was elected. Peterson is Canadian. How come he never compliments William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was Canada's Prime Minister during the war, and who historian Robert Bothwell says did a commendable job of mobilizing the country in support of Britain? Although not a major power, Canada's shining moment in World War II involved the liberation of the Netherlands. So why does Peterson never mention that? Why no shout out to the Canadian Armed Forces who helped free the Dutch, including Dutch Jews? Instead, Peterson likes to remind his lobsters that they wouldn't have helped Anne Frank. Peterson, quote, "It's like, read the book Ordinary Men like you're one of the damn policemen, which is how you should read history, right? You read about Nazi Germany and you think, well, I'm Oskar Schindler, I'd save the Jews. It's like, no, you wouldn't," audience laughs. Right, you wouldn't, because people didn't. And the probability is very high that you wouldn't. And all you have to do is think it through, you know? And Frank, it's like you're really going to put your family at risk to hide a group of another family in your attic for like multiple years while there's Nazis parading the streets? And where if you get exposed, you all die? You're gonna do that, are you? It's very unlikely." End quote. Peterson never compliments the Americans, British, or other allies for defeating the Axis and re-establishing peace and order in Western Europe. Instead, he has imitated goose-stepping in class and said, quote, "You think about the Nazis and their goose-stepping. What's happening is that every single person in the military becomes an identical unit, right? They're all uniform, and they're all imitating the dictator in an absolutely perfect way. And so the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order." End quote. Lobsters are rather uniform, are they not? After the Americans liberated Paris in August 1944, columns of U.S. soldiers, tanks, and jeeps proceeded down the Champs-Élysées in the kind of orderly fashion that tends to make JP all hot and bothered. However, he reserves his admiration for the columns of Wehrmacht soldiers at Nuremberg, routinely making statements like, quote, "So that's Nuremberg, right? That was the biggest rally grounds ever made in human history. Nuremberg. Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle. Look how absolutely perfectly ordered that is. And Hitler was very good at listening to the German population, and what they were demanding in a period of chaos was order. And so that was exactly what he decided to provide. Spectacles of order." End quote. Mein Kampf is part biography, but it's also a kind of guidebook for apostles to spread the word. In Mein Kampf, Hitler counsels would-be apostles for the National Socialist cause that if they're going to lie, they may as well tell whoppers. Hitler, quote, "In the big lie there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily, and thus in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and continue to think that there may be some other explanation." End quote. This passage can be found in Hitler's Mein Kampf and Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. It comes with a citation. It's another one of the doctor's pranks. He can reveal his main source of inspiration and the guidance that encourages him to tell the big lie, that he is warning against the resurgence of Nazism while he actually promotes Nazism. He cites a book he has systematically plagiarized, yet due to the primitive simplicity of his lobsters' minds, they will deny evidence and will doubt and waver and continue to think that there may be some other explanation. In 12 Rules for Life, Peterson also writes, quote, "Lobsters are still comparatively primitive," end quote. This is a reference to the Hitler line about, quote, "the primitive simplicity of people's minds," end quote. And, as Peterson has said, quote, "Lobsters aren't very complicated, they hardly have a brain at all," end quote. This statement speaks to the difficulty of knowing when a narcissist is lying, because even compulsive liars occasionally tell the truth. Thank you for listening, and please hit like and subscribe.